Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The nightmares started 3 weeks ago, and they haven't stopped since. Every time I close my eyes, I see Tyler's face from that last dinner, laughing at something ridiculous Kevin said about the buffet prawns. I was a junior accountant at the time, 26 years old, sharing a cramped apartment in Chicago with 3 guys who'd become my closest friends since college. We'd been planning this Caribbean cruise for almost 2 years, saving up money, requesting time off work, the whole 9 yards. It was supposed to be our big celebration trip before 2 of us moved away for new jobs. The 4 of us, me, Tyler, Kevin, and Josh, had booked adjoining rooms on the 7th deck of the Coral Princess. Tyler was the spontaneous one, always pushing us to try new things, while Kevin kept us grounded with his practical jokes, and Josh documented everything with his camera. We'd been friends since freshman year, and this cruise felt like the perfect way to cap off that chapter of our lives. The ship was massive, one of those floating cities with multiple pools, restaurants, and entertainment venues. We spent the first 2 days just exploring, trying different bars and planning which excursions to book at the ports. Tyler had this weird habit of waking up super early to watch the sunrise from the upper deck. He'd been doing it since day one, always with his coffee and that beaten-up journal he carried everywhere. The guy was obsessed with capturing perfect moments, whether it was photographing the ocean or writing down random thoughts about life. On the 3rd morning, he mentioned seeing some crew members having heated conversations near the restricted areas around 5 a.m. He joked about it at breakfast, saying they looked like they were discussing something serious, not just routine ship business. We laughed it off, but Tyler kept bringing it up throughout the day, asking if we'd noticed anything strange about certain staff members. That evening was when everything started feeling different. We'd had dinner at the main restaurant, and Tyler seemed more observant than usual, constantly scanning the dining room and pointing out crew members he'd seen during his morning walks. He started keeping track of their rotations and shift changes, which we thought was just his analytical mind getting bored. During dessert, he leaned in close and whispered that he'd overheard 2 housekeeping staff talking about another one in rapid Spanish. But when they noticed him listening, they immediately switched to English and changed the subject. The way he described their reaction, sudden silence, nervous glances, quick departure, made us all pause our conversation. We spent the rest of the night at the casino, then hit up the late-night comedy show before heading back to our rooms around 1 a.m. Tyler was in room 7142, right next to mine, and we said our goodnights through the adjoining door like always. I remember hearing him moving around for maybe 20 minutes, opening and closing drawers, running water, the usual bedtime routine. The last thing I heard was his TV turning on to some late-night talk show, which wasn't unusual since he often fell asleep with it on. The ocean was particularly rough that night, and the ship's rocking actually helped me fall asleep faster than normal. The pounding on my door started at 6:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I stared at the digital clock, confused and groggy, wondering why housekeeping would be so aggressive so early. But it wasn't housekeeping. It was Kevin and Josh, both looking panicked and talking over each other. They'd gone to Tyler's room to surprise him with coffee and pastries from the breakfast buffet, but he wasn't there. His bed was still made. His journal was open on the desk with fresh writing from the night before, and his balcony door was wide open with the curtains whipping around in the morning breeze. His coffee maker was still set up for his usual 5 a.m. routine, but the timer never went off. We immediately called ship security, and within minutes, our hallway was swarming with crew members. The head of security, a stern woman named Captain Martinez, took our statements with what seemed like practiced efficiency. She asked about Tyler's mental state, whether he'd been drinking heavily, if he had any history of sleepwalking or depression. Her questions felt rehearsed, like she'd asked them many times before. When we mentioned Tyler's observations about crew conversations and his habit of exploring restricted areas, her demeanor shifted slightly. She became more formal, telling us that passengers sometimes misinterpret routine operational discussions, and that Tyler had likely suffered an unfortunate accident during his early morning routine. The ship's announcement came 2 hours later, a somber message about a passenger who had gone overboard during the night, followed by a moment of silence. But here's what bothered me. They never actually searched the ship thoroughly. No systematic room-by-room check. No announcement asking other passengers if they'd seen anything unusual. Instead, they immediately launched into their overboard protocol, scanning the ocean surface with binoculars and contacting the Coast Guard. When Josh suggested they review security footage from the deck cameras, Captain Martinez explained that the cameras in that section had been undergoing maintenance. The timing seemed impossibly convenient, and her explanation came too quickly, like she'd prepared it in advance. That afternoon, while the three of us sat in the main lounge trying to process what had happened, we overheard a conversation that made our suspicions concrete. 2 crew members, a maintenance worker and someone from guest services, were talking quietly at a nearby table, probably assuming we couldn't hear them over the ambient noise. The maintenance guy mentioned the 3rd one this season, and how they needed to be more careful about selecting the right candidates. The guest services woman hushed him immediately, reminding him that management handles the documentation, and that their job was just to maintain the schedule. When they noticed us listening, they abruptly ended their conversation and walked away in opposite directions. We spent the rest of the day quietly investigating, talking to other passengers and asking casual questions about whether they'd noticed anything unusual. An elderly couple from Texas told us they'd heard arguing on the deck above them around 2 a.m., but when they looked out their balcony, they only saw crew members cleaning equipment. A woman traveling alone mentioned seeing someone being escorted through the service corridors the night before, but she'd assumed it was just a drunk passenger being helped to their room. Every story we heard painted a picture of late-night activity that didn't align with normal cruise operations. The crew's explanations became increasingly inconsistent when we asked follow-up questions about their procedures and protocols. The breaking point came on our last night aboard the ship. Josh had been documenting everything in his phone, photos, notes, recordings of conversations, and planned to contact authorities once we reached port. Around 11 p.m., there was a knock on his door. When he opened it, 2 crew members claimed they needed to inspect his room for maintenance issues that had been reported. They were polite but insistent, and when Josh refused, they showed him an official-looking document about mandatory safety inspections. While they inspected his room, his phone mysteriously disappeared from his nightstand. The crew members found nothing wrong and left after 20 minutes, but Josh's evidence was gone. Captain Martinez later explained that phones sometimes get misplaced during rough seas and offered to help him file a lost property claim. We disembarked the next morning with a mixture of grief and frustration, knowing we'd never get real answers about what happened to Tyler. The cruise line sent us a formal letter 2 weeks later, expressing condolences and stating that their investigation concluded Tyler had accidentally fallen overboard during his morning routine. They included a small compensation check and asked us to sign a document acknowledging their thorough investigation. None of us signed it. Instead, Kevin found a maritime lawyer who specializes in cruise ship incidents, and we learned that Tyler wasn't the first passenger to disappear from that particular ship. There had been at least 6 similar cases over the past 3 years, all ruled accidental, all involving passengers who had been asking questions or exploring areas they shouldn't have been. The lawyer is still building a case, but the cruise line has powerful legal teams, and most incidents happen in international waters where jurisdiction gets complicated. I think about Tyler every day, wondering if he discovered something that made him dangerous to their operation, and whether we'll ever know the truth about what really happened that night. What happened on that cruise ship will haunt me forever. I'm a 34-year-old accountant from Denver, and last September I booked myself on the Ocean Majesty for what was supposed to be a relaxing week in the Caribbean. After grinding through 2 years of 60-hour weeks at my firm, I'd finally gotten the promotion I'd been chasing, and my doctor had started making pointed comments about my stress levels during my annual checkup. The cruise seemed like the perfect remedy. 7 days of unlimited food, poolside lounging, and absolutely zero spreadsheets. I'd never been on a cruise before, but the brochure made it seem like floating paradise with its massive pools, multiple restaurants, and enough entertainment to keep anyone busy. The first 3 days were everything I'd hoped for. I spent my mornings on Deck 7 with a paperback novel, afternoons exploring the ship's endless corridors, and evenings trying different restaurants. The Ocean Majesty was like a floating city, nearly 4,000 passengers and crew with decks that seemed to stretch on forever. I'd made friends with a retired couple from Portland, Janet and Robert, who'd been on dozens of cruises and kept pointing out all the best spots on the ship. Janet had this infectious laugh that could be heard 3 tables away in the dining room, and Robert always wore these ridiculous Hawaiian shirts that somehow looked distinguished on him. We'd established a routine of meeting for breakfast each morning at the Serenity Deck restaurant, where the coffee was strong and the ocean views were spectacular. But on the 4th morning, Wednesday, everything changed. I woke up around 6:30 a.m. to this weird sensation. The ship felt different. Not the usual gentle rocking motion I'd gotten used to, but something more erratic, almost jerky. The engines sounded different too, like they were straining harder than usual. I figured maybe we were hitting some rough weather, but when I pulled back the curtains of my balcony door, the ocean looked relatively calm. The morning sun was casting this beautiful golden path across the water, and I could see several other ships in the distance, which was unusual because for the past 3 days we'd been mostly alone on the open sea. I got dressed and headed to meet Janet and Robert for breakfast, assuming they'd have some explanation for the ship's strange behavior. When I arrived at the restaurant, the atmosphere was tense. Conversations were hushed, and I noticed several crew members huddled together near the coffee station, speaking in urgent whispers. Janet and Robert were already at our usual table, but instead of their typical cheerful morning banter, they looked worried. Robert's Hawaiian shirt today was a bright orange with palm trees, but his face was pale beneath his vacation tan. Janet wasn't laughing at all. She was gripping her coffee cup with both hands and staring out the window at those distant ships. The moment I sat down, she leaned forward and whispered that she'd heard some disturbing rumors from other passengers. Apparently, people were saying the ship had taken an unexpected route during the night, and some of the crew members seemed genuinely concerned about where we were heading. Around 9 a.m., the ship's intercom crackled to life with Captain Harrison's voice. He had this deep, authoritative tone that usually made announcements about dinner reservations and entertainment schedules, but this time he sounded strained. He announced that due to navigational adjustments, all passengers were required to return to their cabins immediately and remain there until further notice. No explanation, no estimated time frame, just a direct order that sent a chill through the entire dining room. The crew members who had been whispering suddenly sprang into action, politely but firmly directing passengers toward the elevators. I watched as families with young children gathered their belongings, confusion and worry written across their faces. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, kept asking her mother why they couldn't go to the pool, and her mother just kept saying, "Soon, sweetheart," in this voice that didn't sound convinced. The walk back to my cabin felt like a funeral march. The ship's corridors, which had been filled with laughter and excitement for the past 3 days, were now eerily quiet except for the sound of footsteps and nervous whispers. I passed the main deck on my way to the elevator and caught a glimpse of something that made my chest tighten. Those ships in the distance weren't pleasure craft or commercial vessels. They were military ships, and they were getting closer. Their gray hulls cut through the water with purpose, and I could see uniformed figures moving on their decks. The morning sun reflected off what looked like mounted equipment that definitely wasn't for fishing or transportation. I pressed the elevator button repeatedly, suddenly desperate to get to my cabin and try to make sense of what was happening. Once locked in my cabin, I immediately went to my balcony and peered through the glass door. The military vessels were close enough now that I could make out details that made my heart race. There were at least 4 ships forming what looked like a perimeter around us, and they all flew flags I didn't recognize, red with some kind of symbol I couldn't quite make out from this distance. The largest ship had what appeared to be a helicopter landing pad, and I could see armed personnel moving around on its deck. Through my cabin walls, I could hear other passengers talking in hushed, panicked voices. The woman in the cabin next to mine was crying, and I could hear a man's voice trying to comfort her. The ship's engines had gone almost silent, and we were barely moving now, just drifting with these military vessels maintaining their positions around us like we were some kind of prize they were guarding. The intercom crackled again around 11 a.m., but this time it wasn't Captain Harrison. A voice I didn't recognize, speaking with what sounded like a foreign accent, came through the speakers. He identified himself as Commander Valdez from the Maritime Defense Force, and his words sent ice through my veins. He announced that the Ocean Majesty had entered restricted territorial waters without authorization and was now under military escort. All passengers were to remain in their cabins while the situation was resolved through proper diplomatic channels. The way he said resolved made it sound like we were cargo rather than people. After the announcement ended, an eerie silence settled over the ship. Even the usual sounds of the ocean seemed muffled, like the entire world was holding its breath waiting to see what would happen next. Hours crawled by with no updates. I tried calling the front desk, but the line was busy. I attempted to use the ship's Wi-Fi to contact my family, but the internet had been cut off. Through my balcony door, I watched the military ships maintain their positions, never moving more than a few hundred yards away. Around 2 p.m., I heard helicopters overhead. Not just one, but several, their rotors creating a thunderous noise that seemed to shake the entire ship. I pressed my face against the glass and saw them circling above us like mechanical vultures. One helicopter was much larger than the others, and I could see uniformed figures rappelling down ropes onto our ship's upper deck. The sight of armed soldiers actually boarding our vessel made everything terrifyingly real. This wasn't some misunderstanding that would be cleared up with a few phone calls. We were genuinely trapped in the middle of an international incident. The worst part was the uncertainty. Nobody knew what was happening or how long it would last. I could hear children crying in distant cabins, and the elderly couple across the hall from me were having a heated argument about whether they should try to leave their room. The man kept insisting they had rights as American citizens, while his wife begged him not to do anything that might make the situation worse. Around 4 p.m., I heard footsteps in the corridor. Heavy boots, not the soft-soled shoes the regular crew wore. There was a sharp knock on someone's door, followed by muffled conversation in what sounded like Spanish. Then another knock, closer to my room. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When the knock came to my door, I stood there paralyzed, afraid to answer but equally afraid of what would happen if I didn't. When I finally opened the door, there was a uniformed soldier standing in the hallway alongside one of our ship's crew members, a young woman named Lisa, who'd been serving drinks at the pool bar just yesterday. Lisa looked terrified, her usual bright smile replaced by barely contained panic. The soldier was checking room numbers against a list, and he asked for my identification in heavily accented English. His uniform was crisp and military precise, with patches I didn't recognize, and equipment that looked serious and functional. After examining my passport, he simply nodded and moved on to the next door. Lisa caught my eye for just a moment, and I could see her mouth the word sorry before they continued down the corridor. That brief interaction somehow made everything more real, seeing someone I'd laughed with just days before now reduced to a terrified guide for foreign military personnel. Around 7 p.m., Captain Harrison's voice returned to the intercom, but he sounded like a completely different person. His usual confident tone was replaced by something that bordered on defeat. He announced that the ship had indeed entered disputed territorial waters due to what he called navigational errors, and that diplomatic negotiations were ongoing. He assured us that our safety was the top priority and that we should remain calm and patient. But then he said something that made my entire body go numb. He mentioned that the ship's original route had been altered to optimize fuel efficiency, and that this decision had led to our current predicament. As the implications of his words sank in, I realized that someone had made a calculated decision to save money by cutting through restricted waters, and now 4,000 people were paying the price. The standoff continued through the night, with military vessels maintaining their positions and armed personnel patrolling our decks. We were released the next morning after what I later learned were intense diplomatic negotiations, but the cruise company quietly settled lawsuits and fired Captain Harrison within weeks. I never found out exactly which country's waters we'd entered, but I'll never forget the feeling of being completely powerless in the middle of the ocean, trapped between corporate greed and international politics. Working as a pharmaceutical sales rep meant I was constantly traveling, but the Mediterranean cruise was supposed to be different. My first real vacation in 3 years. At 28, I felt like I'd been running on empty for months, closing deals and living out of hotel rooms across the Midwest. The cruise was a birthday gift to myself. 7 days of complete disconnection from spreadsheets and conference calls. I'd specifically chosen the Celestial Horizon because of its reputation for fine dining and luxury amenities. The ship was massive, holding nearly 4,000 passengers, but somehow it felt intimate with its marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers that caught the Mediterranean sunlight in brilliant prisms. The trouble started on our 3rd day at sea, right after we'd left the port of Barcelona. I'd been looking forward to dinner at Palazzo Nero, the ship's most exclusive restaurant on Deck 12. The reservation had cost me an extra $200, but the reviews promised an unforgettable culinary experience. The maitre d', a tall man with silver hair and an Italian accent, seated me at a corner table with a perfect view of the endless ocean. The ambiance was perfect, soft jazz playing, candles flickering on white tablecloths, and the gentle sway of the ship creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. I ordered the chef's tasting menu, 7 courses paired with wines I'd never heard of but trusted the sommelier's recommendations. Everything seemed flawless, from the amuse-bouche to the final dessert, a delicate panna cotta that dissolved on my tongue like silk. The first signs appeared around 2 in the morning. I woke up with what I initially thought was motion sickness, a queasy feeling in my stomach, and a slight headache. But as I lay there in my cabin, listening to the ship's engines humming beneath me, I realized this was different. The nausea came in waves, accompanied by sharp cramps that made me curl up in my narrow bed. I'd been on cruise ships before and never experienced seasickness this severe. The room felt like it was spinning faster than the ship's natural movement, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it before my stomach emptied itself violently. The taste was metallic, bitter, nothing like the exquisite meal I'd enjoyed hours earlier. Between retching, I could hear similar sounds coming from neighboring cabins, muffled groans and the unmistakable sound of others being sick. By morning, the ship's medical bay was overwhelmed. I'd managed to get dressed and make my way to Deck 5, where a line of pale, shaking passengers stretched down the corridor. The ship's doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes but visible concern etched on her face, was moving between patients with increasing urgency. I overheard her speaking quietly to a nurse about the unusual number of cases they were seeing. Nearly 60 passengers had reported similar symptoms overnight. What struck me as odd was the pattern. Everyone who'd fallen ill had dined at Palazzo Nero the previous evening. The other restaurants on the ship, the buffet, the steakhouse, even the casual pizza joint, their patrons seemed perfectly fine. As I waited for nearly 2 hours, I watched more people stumble in, some so weak they needed help walking. The ship's crew kept reassuring us it was just a stomach bug, something that happens on cruises. But their nervous glances and hushed conversations suggested they knew this was far from normal. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next 24 hours. What had started as severe food poisoning quickly escalated into something far more sinister. 3 passengers, an elderly couple from Ohio, and a young mother traveling with her teenage daughter were moved to the ship's intensive care unit after their conditions became critical. Their symptoms had progressed beyond simple gastroenteritis. They were experiencing severe dehydration, erratic heart rhythms, and what the medical staff quietly described as neurological complications. I learned this information from Amanda, a nurse I'd befriended during my frequent visits to the medical bay. She worked the night shift and had been with the cruise line for 8 years, long enough to know when something was seriously wrong. During one of our conversations, she pulled me aside and whispered that the blood tests were showing unusual toxin levels, something she'd never seen in typical food poisoning cases. The ship's captain finally addressed the passengers on day 4, his voice crackling through the intercom system with barely concealed tension. He announced that they were conducting a full investigation into the isolated incident at Palazzo Nero, and that all affected passengers would receive full medical care and compensation. But his words felt hollow when I looked around the ship and saw the growing number of empty deck chairs and closed cabin doors. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had been a floating paradise now felt like a prison. Passengers who hadn't been affected whispered in small groups, casting suspicious glances at crew members who passed by. The dining rooms were half empty, with most people too afraid to eat anything beyond sealed snacks they'd brought from home. I noticed increased security presence throughout the ship, guards stationed at entrances to restricted areas that had been freely accessible before. The crew's behavior had changed too. They moved with nervous efficiency, avoiding eye contact and speaking in hushed tones when they thought passengers weren't listening. The breakthrough came on day 5, and it wasn't from the official investigation. I was sitting in the library, one of the few quiet spaces left on the ship, when I overheard a heated conversation between 2 housekeeping staff members. They were speaking in rapid Spanish, but my college courses helped me catch fragments of their discussion. They mentioned Carlos and venganza, revenge. One of them kept shaking her head, saying something about how they'd warned management about his behavior months ago. When they noticed me listening, they quickly dispersed, but not before I caught the name of the person they were discussing: Carlos Mendoza, a sous chef who'd been working in Palazzo Nero's kitchen. Amanda later confirmed what I'd suspected. Carlos had been reprimanded multiple times for his attitude toward passengers and management. Apparently, he'd been passed over for a promotion to head chef just weeks before our cruise, a position that went to someone with less experience but better people skills. The pieces began falling into place with terrifying clarity. Carlos had systematically contaminated specific dishes during that Tuesday evening service, targeting the most expensive menu items that only paying customers from Palazzo Nero would order. But what made this even more chilling was the precision involved. He'd somehow managed to avoid poisoning other crew members or passengers from different restaurants, suggesting this wasn't a random act of rage, but a calculated attack. I learned from Amanda that they'd found traces of industrial cleaning solvent mixed with a common kitchen ingredient, something that would mask the taste but cause severe internal damage. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just victims of food poisoning. We were casualties in one man's twisted attempt at revenge against the cruise line. The worst part was knowing that Carlos was still somewhere on this ship, still preparing food, still walking the corridors, while passengers continued to suffer from his deliberate actions. The paranoia became suffocating once I realized the truth. Every crew member became a potential threat, every meal a possible weapon. I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. The way certain staff members avoided eye contact, how some seemed to know more than they were letting on, the subtle tensions between different departments. During dinner service, I watched the kitchen staff through the glass partition, studying their movements, wondering who else might be involved. Were there other disgruntled employees? Had Carlos acted alone, or was this part of a larger conspiracy? The questions consumed me, making it impossible to relax or enjoy even the simplest pleasures. I began hoarding snacks from the gift shop, items that came in sealed packages I could trust. Sleep became elusive as I lay in my cabin, listening to every footstep in the corridor, wondering if someone might slip something under my door or tamper with the ventilation system. The ship that had once felt like a floating palace now felt like a maze of potential dangers. The turning point came on day 6, when I witnessed something that confirmed my worst fears. I was walking past the crew quarters around midnight, unable to sleep and hoping the night air on deck might help clear my head. Through a partially open door, I saw Carlos talking animatedly with 2 other crew members I didn't recognize. What chilled me to the bone was the satisfied expression on his face. Not the look of someone who'd made a terrible mistake, but of someone who'd accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. He was gesturing toward the upper decks, toward the passenger areas, and I caught fragments of English mixed with Spanish. I heard him say something about teaching them a lesson and showing them what happens when you don't respect us. The other crew members seemed uncomfortable, one of them shaking his head and backing away from the conversation. But Carlos continued talking, his voice growing more animated, more pleased with himself. I realized then that he had no remorse whatsoever. In his mind, he'd successfully struck back at the cruise line and its passengers, and he was proud of what he'd done. I knew I had to act, but the isolation of being trapped at sea made everything more complicated. The next morning, I approached Amanda with everything I'd overheard and witnessed. She listened with growing horror, confirming that Carlos had indeed been scheduled to work the kitchen during our fateful dinner service. Together, we decided to bypass the ship's security, who might be compromised or simply incompetent, and contact the authorities directly. Using the ship's satellite communication system, Amanda helped me place a call to the Coast Guard, providing them with detailed information about Carlos's identity, his motive, and the evidence we'd gathered. The response was immediate and decisive. Within hours, a Coast Guard cutter intercepted our ship, and federal agents boarded to take Carlos into custody. The arrest happened so quickly that most passengers didn't even realize what was occurring. They simply saw additional security personnel moving through the ship with purposeful efficiency. The resolution came swiftly once Carlos was in custody. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of several crew members who'd been afraid to speak up earlier, he confessed to deliberately contaminating the food with industrial cleaning chemicals. The investigation revealed that he'd been planning this attack for weeks, meticulously studying the restaurant's procedures and timing his actions to cause maximum harm. All affected passengers were immediately evacuated to a medical facility in Naples, where we received proper treatment for the chemical poisoning. The cruise line faced massive lawsuits and eventually filed for bankruptcy, but more importantly, Carlos was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for attempted murder and bioterrorism. I recovered fully after several weeks of treatment, though I've never been able to enjoy fine dining the same way again. The experience taught me that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces, and that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those who feel they have nothing left to lose. To this day, I still check the seals on my food packages and avoid eating at restaurants where I can't see the kitchen. Some fears never completely fade, even when justice is served. Working the night shift as a pool deck supervisor aboard the Celestial Voyager wasn't exactly my dream job, but it paid well enough to keep me going while I finished my marine biology degree. The spring of 2019 had been exhausting, cruise season in full swing, screaming kids during the day, and then the eerie silence that settled over the pool decks once the sun went down. I was 22, bunking in a cramped crew quarters on Deck 3, surviving on whatever leftovers I could grab from the crew mess hall and the occasional snack from the passenger buffets when no one was looking. Most nights, I'd spend my shift reading textbooks under the dim deck lights, occasionally walking the perimeter to check for any equipment issues or passengers trying to sneak in for a midnight swim. The pool areas were completely off limits after 11 p.m. Ship policy was crystal clear about that, especially when we were at sea. What made the job bearable was the solitude. During those quiet hours between midnight and 6 a.m., I had the entire aquatic complex to myself. The main pool, the kiddie splash zone, the hot tubs, and the Olympic-sized lap pool that was reserved for serious swimmers and morning water aerobics classes. The silence was almost therapeutic after dealing with the chaos of families and drunk passengers all day. I'd set up my little command station on a deck chair next to the main pool, textbooks spread out on a small table, a thermos of coffee that would last me through the night. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the ship's engines far below, the occasional creak of the hull, and the soft whoosh of water from the filtration systems making their rounds. It was peaceful, predictable, and exactly what I needed to focus on my studies while earning decent money during the cruise season. Everything changed on a Wednesday night in late July. I'd been on the job for about 3 months by then, settled into my routine of arriving at 11:45 p.m., doing my initial safety check, and then diving into my coursework. The weather had been perfect that week, and the pool deck still held the day's warmth even after sunset. I remember settling into my chair with my organic chemistry textbook, the pool lights casting their familiar blue glow across the water's surface. The ship had been particularly busy that day. I could tell from the scattered pool toys and the slightly elevated chlorine levels that maintenance had to adjust after heavy use. But now, at nearly 1 a.m., the area was completely deserted, just like every other night. I was deep into a chapter about molecular structures when I heard it, a distinct splash coming from the direction of the lap pool. The sound cut through the steady rhythm of the ship's engines like a knife through silence. At first I figured it was just one of the automatic pool cleaners hitting the pool wall a little harder than usual, due to the ship's gentle rocking motion. Those things had a mind of their own sometimes, and the maintenance crew was constantly adjusting their programming to account for the ship's movement and keep them from getting stuck in corners or making too much noise. But then, I heard it again, followed by what sounded unmistakably like someone gasping for air. The sound sent a chill down my spine because it was so clearly human, desperate, panicked breathing that echoed off the metal walls and ceiling of the enclosed pool area. I closed my textbook and stood up, grabbing my flashlight from the equipment bag. The lap pool was about 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a decorative wall of fake palm trees and tropical plants. As I walked toward the sound, my deck shoes squeaking slightly on the wet non-slip surface, I called out the standard warning about the pool being closed. No response, just the continued splashing and those awful gasping sounds that seemed to bounce off the ship's hull. When I rounded the corner and shined my flashlight toward the lap pool, my heart nearly stopped. The water was completely empty, not a single person in sight, no pool cleaner running, nothing that could explain the sounds I was hearing so clearly. But the water itself was moving. Violent ripples spreading across the surface like someone was thrashing around in the deep end, despite the ship's steady course through calm seas. The gasping sounds were louder now, more frantic, and they seemed to be coming from directly above the churning water. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, sweeping my flashlight beam across every inch of the pool, checking behind the starting blocks, scanning the pool deck for any sign of an intruder. The sounds continued for maybe another 30 seconds before they abruptly stopped, and the water settled back to its normal, mirror-like calm. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual hum of the ship's engines seemed muted, as if the entire vessel was holding its breath. I spent the next hour doing a thorough search of the entire pool complex, checking every possible hiding spot, every maintenance room, every corner where someone could have concealed themselves. I even called ship security to report a possible trespasser, but by the time Officer Brennan arrived, there was absolutely nothing to show him except my own paranoia. He walked the perimeter with me, checked the locked access doors, and confirmed that all the security cameras were functioning properly. The footage from that night would later show me walking around with my flashlight, pointing it at an empty pool, talking to thin air. Brennan was professional about it, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes when he suggested I might have heard sounds carrying over from the lower deck pools, or maybe just the ship's hull settling in the waves. I knew what I'd heard, though. It was definitely coming from our lap pool, and it was definitely not normal. The sound was too human, too desperate, too real to be explained away by ship noises or my imagination. The next few nights passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the memory of those desperate, gasping sounds. I found myself constantly glancing toward the lap pool, jumping at every little noise the filtration system made, every creak of the ship's hull as it cut through the waves. I tried to convince myself it was just stress from finals week, maybe too much caffeine, but deep down I knew better. Then, about a week later, I was chatting with Nancy, one of the day shift supervisors, during our shift change. She was a veteran employee, had been working on cruise ships for almost 15 years, and she knew every piece of gossip and history about the fleet. When I casually mentioned the weird sounds I'd been hearing at night, her expression changed completely. She glanced around to make sure no one else was listening, then pulled me aside near the equipment storage room. That's when she told me about what happened during a crossing in the spring of 2017, something that had been completely scrubbed from the official records. Two young guys, both college students working their first contract on the ship, had drowned in that exact same lap pool during what was supposed to be a harmless hazing ritual. Their names were Benjamin and Nathan, both 19, both from small towns in the Midwest who'd never worked on a cruise ship before. According to Nancy, a group of off-duty crew members had been drinking heavily one night during a sea day and decided to initiate the new guys with some kind of twisted swimming challenge. The details were murky, but apparently they'd tied weights to the boys' ankles and made them swim laps while the others timed them and shouted encouragement from the pool deck. What started as stupid fun turned deadly when both Benjamin and Nathan went under and never came back up. The other crew members were too drunk and panicked to mount an effective rescue, and by the time they managed to pull the bodies out, it was too late. The cruise line's legal team had moved fast, paying off families, threatening lawsuits, making sure the incident never appeared in any official report or news coverage. Nancy's voice was barely above a whisper as she finished the story, her eyes darting around nervously like she expected someone from management to appear and silence her. She told me that several crew members had quit immediately after the incident, unable to handle the guilt and the cover-up that followed. The staff members directly involved had been quietly transferred to other ships or let go with generous severance packages and non-disclosure agreements. Even the pool itself had been completely drained, scrubbed, and refilled with fresh water during the next port stop, though Nancy suspected it was more about erasing evidence than maintaining cleanliness. What haunted her most was that both Benjamin and Nathan had been strong swimmers. Benjamin had been on his high school swim team, and Nathan had worked as a lifeguard at a community pool back home. They shouldn't have drowned, not under normal circumstances, but the combination of alcohol, peer pressure, and weighted restraints had created a perfect storm of tragedy in the confines of that ship's pool. After hearing that story, the sounds I'd been experiencing took on a completely different meaning. Every night shift became an exercise in controlled terror as I waited for those desperate gasping sounds to return. And they did return, always around the same time, always from the lap pool, always lasting just long enough to make my skin crawl before falling silent again. I started documenting everything. The exact times, the duration of the sounds, the ship's position and weather conditions, anything that might help me understand what was happening. The pattern was eerily consistent. The sounds would begin around 12:45 a.m. and last for approximately 2 to 3 minutes, always starting with splashing and escalating to those horrible gasping sounds. I even tried recording them with my phone, but the audio files came out completely silent, capturing nothing but the ambient noise of the ship's engines and my own nervous breathing. It was as if whatever was happening existed in a space that technology couldn't touch. The breaking point came on a humid Friday night in early August. The sounds had been getting more frequent, sometimes happening twice in one shift, and I was starting to seriously question my sanity. That particular night, we were sailing through calm waters between ports, and I decided to position myself right next to the lap pool before the usual time, determined to figure out what was really going on. I set up a chair at the pool's edge, my flashlight ready, and waited. At exactly 12:47 a.m., the water began to churn violently in the deep end, and the gasping sound started immediately. But this time, They were so clear and desperate that I could almost make out words. It sounded like someone was trying to scream for help, but couldn't get enough air, their voice gurgling and choking on water that wasn't there. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was hearing Benjamin and Nathan's final moments, playing out over and over again in some kind of endless loop. The terror in those sounds was so raw and real that I started crying, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sadness of two young lives cut short by stupidity and cruelty. That's when I made my decision. I couldn't let this continue, not for my own peace of mind and not for whatever was left of Benjamin and Nathan. The next day when we docked in port, I researched everything I could about the two victims, tracking down their hometown newspapers and social media profiles that their families had left as memorials. I printed out their photos at an internet cafe and wrote a simple letter apologizing for what had happened to them and acknowledging that their deaths hadn't been forgotten. That night, I placed the photos and letter on the pool deck next to the deep end, along with 2 small bouquets of flowers I'd managed to buy from a vendor at our last port. I sat there for hours talking to the empty pool about Benjamin and Nathan, telling them about my own life, my studies, my dreams of becoming a marine biologist. I promised them that I would make sure their story was told, that their deaths wouldn't remain buried under legal threats and hush money. The sound stopped that night and never returned during my remaining weeks aboard the Celestial Voyager. The pool finally found its peace, and so did I. I booked the cruise as a way to reset after a rough year. My sister had just moved across the country. I was between jobs and everything felt stuck. A friend convinced me that a week at sea might help clear my head. So I grabbed a deal on a mid-size cruise line that set sail from Galveston. The ship wasn't massive, more of a mid-tier option, not the flashy kind with water slides and zip lines, but still had the usual amenities: pool deck, dining hall, casino, and bars scattered across the decks. I went solo, figuring I'd spend most of my time reading, journaling, and maybe striking up a few conversations with strangers. I didn't expect to get wrapped up in anything weird, definitely not something like this. By the second day, I'd fallen into a nice little rhythm. Mornings were for wandering the upper decks with coffee, afternoons by the pool, and evenings at the lounge tucked near the stern. Low lights, soft jazz, and a surprisingly decent bartender named Ellis. Everyone seemed to know him. He had that easy charm you see in people who've done the job for years. Smooth but never fake, good with names, always remembering your drink after one order. He'd joke around, ask about your day, toss little compliments in when you were least expecting. The kind of person who made you feel like you were exactly where you needed to be. I started going there more often. Not just for the drinks, but for the atmosphere. It felt cozy and detached from the crowd. One night there were only a few of us at the bar, me, a couple from Vermont, and an older guy traveling with his adult daughter. We ended up chatting for a good while, and I remember Ellis laughing at one of my dumb stories about a failed Tinder date. He leaned in and said, "You'd be surprised how many disasters start with good cocktails," and winked as he handed me the tab. I paid with my card like always, barely glanced at it before sliding it back into my wallet. It wasn't until 2 days later that things started to feel strange. I'd gotten a notification from my bank while we were docked in Belize, something about a charge at a boutique in Miami. I hadn't been anywhere near Miami in months. I shrugged it off at first, assuming it was a glitch or maybe something recurring I forgot about. But then another charge popped up, this time for a gas station in Orlando. That's when the tension crept in. I locked my card immediately through the app, but even as I did it, I kept replaying my last few purchases on the ship. I hadn't used the card anywhere else, just that lounge bar and only with Ellis. Back on the ship, I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to start accusing anyone without proof, and part of me still wanted to believe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone skimmed my card before I even got on board. But later that night at dinner, I overheard a couple at the next table whispering about weird charges on their credit card, too. They were trying to figure out how they'd been hit, saying they only used it once, at the ship's bar. I butted in gently, just to ask which one. When they said the one in the back near the jazz lounge, it was like a quiet alarm went off in my head. Same place, same bartender. The next morning I went to guest services to report it. I half expected them to brush me off or blame some offshore vendor, but the woman behind the counter didn't even blink. She asked a few questions: what bar, which day, who was working, and then excused herself to talk to someone behind a frosted door. When she came back, her tone had shifted. She thanked me and said they'd been reviewing certain concerns already, and my information was helpful. That's when it hit me that this wasn't an isolated thing. I wasn't the only one. It wasn't even new. Word started spreading faster than anyone could contain it. Onboard rumors are like smoke in a sealed room, hard to ignore. People were suddenly buzzing in corners, pulling out their phones to check their banks, whispering names. I heard Ellis's name more than once. A woman from Deck 6 said her husband caught him holding his phone just a little too long while handling their card. Another guy said he noticed Ellis always turned slightly away when swiping, like he was blocking the view. No one wanted to believe it, though. He was too friendly, too normal. But when too many dots start connecting, you stop pretending they're just random. That night, they closed the bar. No explanation, just a sign that said, "Temporarily unavailable." Ellis was nowhere to be seen, and people were tense. The ship didn't make any official announcements, but everyone knew something had gone down. I passed 2 officers outside the staff corridor near the lower decks, talking in low voices. One of them held a tablet. I only caught a glimpse, but I swear it looked like stills from a security camera. Screenshots frozen mid-motion, with red circles drawn around someone's hand holding a phone near a credit card machine. The rest of the trip had this strange tension floating under the surface. People were polite but guarded. Conversations felt shorter. Eyes lingered longer on the crew. I didn't see Ellis again, not once, and no one would say outright what happened to him. But rumors filled the silence. One version was that he'd been quietly removed at the next port. Another claimed he'd confessed to everything once shown the security footage. Someone said they found dozens of photos in his phone. Cards, close-ups of numbers, names, expiration dates. Whatever the truth was, the trust was gone. I kept replaying our interactions in my head. All those times he smiled, the casual way he held conversations, the jokes, the moments that made you feel like he actually cared. That's what got to me. It wasn't just the theft, it was the way he made you feel safe while doing it. The deception had layers. It was almost elegant, and that's what left a sour taste long after I got off the ship. He didn't just steal money. He used trust as a tool. When I got back to the mainland, the cruise line sent a vague apology email, thanking passengers for their cooperation and assuring us that the matter has been resolved in accordance with maritime and legal standards. My bank refunded the fraudulent charges without much hassle, but I never got a straight answer about how many people were affected. Some said dozens, others guessed over 100. I don't think we'll ever know the real number. He'd probably been doing it for months, maybe longer. Maybe he wasn't even the only one. To this day, I don't use my card at bars, especially not on cruises, and if someone's too friendly too fast, I keep one eye on the charm and the other on their hands. I still think about that trip sometimes. Not the beaches or the sunsets, but that sinking realization that the person pouring your drink might be pocketing something else entirely. And the worst part? You probably thanked him for it. Here I am at 2 a.m., wide awake, and I keep thinking about what happened on that cruise last month. I can't get it out of my head, and maybe writing it down will help me process everything. I'm a 34-year-old accountant from Phoenix, and honestly, the most exciting thing that usually happens in my life is finding a decent parking spot at the mall. My wife Jessica had been begging me to take a vacation for months, saying I appeared ready to burn out completely. She wasn't wrong. I'd been pulling 12-hour days for 3 months straight during tax season. When she found this 7-day Caribbean cruise deal online, I figured why not. It was November, perfect timing to escape the heat back home and just decompress. The ship was called the Royal Horizon, one of those massive floating cities with pools, restaurants, and enough entertainment to keep thousands of people busy. Jessica was thrilled. She'd already planned our entire itinerary before we even boarded. The first 3 days were exactly what I needed. I actually managed to forget about spreadsheets and client deadlines for the first time in months. We ate way too much at the buffet. Jessica dragged me to the dance classes, and I even tried my hand at the rock climbing wall. The weather was perfect. The ocean was this incredible shade of blue I'd never seen before. And for once, I felt like I could actually breathe. Our cabin was on deck 8, starboard side, with a tiny balcony where we'd sit every evening watching the sunset. The crew was friendly, always smiling and asking if we needed anything. Everything was going exactly as planned. And I remember thinking that maybe Jessica was right. Maybe I really did need to take more breaks from work. The ship had this routine to it, this comfortable predictability that made everything feel safe and organized. Meals at the same times, activities scheduled down to the minute, and the gentle rocking motion that helped me sleep better than I had in years. It was Wednesday morning when things started getting weird. I was up early, around 6 a.m., because I'd developed this habit of walking the deck before the crowds appeared. The sunrise over the ocean was always worth the early wake-up call. I was making my usual loop around deck 7 when I heard voices coming from below. Angry, hushed voices that didn't match the usual cheerful crew chatter. I leaned against the railing and could make out at least 4 people arguing in what sounded like a mix of English and Spanish. One voice kept saying, "No puede ser," over and over, which my high school Spanish told me meant, "It can't be." Another voice, definitely American, was saying something about keeping it quiet until we dock. The urgency in their voices made me pause. These weren't the same crew members who'd been serving us drinks and making towel animals for the past 3 days. These voices carried a tension that cut through the peaceful morning air like a knife. What really caught my attention was when I heard footsteps, a lot of them, moving quickly across the metal floors below. I could hear equipment being moved, heavy things being dragged, and what sounded like hammering or banging. The noise echoed up through the ship's structure in a way that made me realize this wasn't normal maintenance work. I'd been on the ship long enough to know the usual sounds: the gentle hum of the engines, the soft whoosh of the air conditioning, the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. This was different. This was urgent, almost frantic activity happening in parts of the ship that passengers weren't supposed to access. When I tried to peer down to see what was happening, I realized I couldn't see anything from my position. The voices stopped abruptly, like someone had noticed me up there. The sudden silence was more unsettling than the noise had been. I waited for a few minutes, but the activity seemed to have moved elsewhere, deeper into the ship where I couldn't hear it anymore. At breakfast, I mentioned what I'd heard to Jessica, but she just laughed it off, saying they were probably doing routine maintenance or preparing for some surprise activity. Her optimism was infectious, and I almost convinced myself she was right. That is, until I noticed something odd while we were eating. 3 crew members I'd never seen before were walking through the dining room, not serving food or cleaning tables, but watching people. They wore the same uniforms as the other crew, but their name tags were different. Instead of the usual cheerful names like Antonio, Cruise Director, or Maria, Guest Services, these just said Staff in plain black letters. They moved with purpose, scanning faces, taking notes on small clipboards. One of them, a tall guy with a neck tattoo that peeked out from his collar, kept staring at our table for longer than was comfortable. When I made eye contact with him, he didn't smile or nod like the other crew members always did. He just kept staring until his supervisor tapped his shoulder and pointed him toward another section of the dining room. The weirdest part was when Jessica got up to get more coffee from the buffet. The guy with the neck tattoo immediately walked over to where she'd been sitting and seemed to be looking at her plate, her napkin, even the chair she'd been using. He was being subtle about it, pretending to wipe down the table next to ours, but I could tell he was studying everything about our spot. When Jessica came back, she was chatting with another passenger, an older woman named Helen from Michigan, who was traveling with her sister. Helen was excited about something, talking rapidly about how she'd seen crew members doing something mysterious down on Deck 3 earlier that morning. She said they'd blocked off an entire section with yellow tape and were only letting certain crew members through. Helen's sister, Margaret, rolled her eyes and said Helen watched too many crime shows, but I could tell Helen was genuinely unsettled by what she'd seen. The fact that someone else had noticed unusual activity made my stomach tighten with a kind of dread I hadn't felt since childhood. By Thursday afternoon, the atmosphere on the ship had completely shifted. Word was spreading among passengers that something was going on in the lower decks. People were whispering in the hallways, gathering in small groups, and sharing theories about what they'd seen or heard. The crew's behavior had changed too. They were still polite, but there was this underlying tension that you could feel in every interaction. When I asked our room steward, Paolo, about the blocked-off areas, his face went pale, and he said management had told them not to discuss operational matters with guests. He looked genuinely scared, which made me realize this wasn't just routine maintenance. The ship's daily newsletter, which usually contained cheerful updates about activities and weather, now included a notice about enhanced security protocols and asked passengers to report any unusual observations to guest services immediately. The fact that they were asking passengers to essentially spy on each other created this paranoid atmosphere where everyone was watching everyone else. What made it worse was that we were supposed to dock in Cozumel the next morning, but there was an announcement that afternoon saying our arrival would be delayed by several hours due to port scheduling conflicts. The captain's voice over the intercom had this forced cheerfulness that didn't match the situation at all. He kept emphasizing how we should enjoy the extra time at sea and take advantage of the ship's amenities, but you could hear the stress underneath his words. That evening, Jessica and I were having dinner when we noticed several passengers arguing with the guest services staff. One couple was demanding to know why their friend's cabin had been searched that afternoon, and another family was upset because their teenage son had been questioned about his whereabouts during the morning hours. The staff kept apologizing and saying it was all part of standard security procedures, but their explanations were vague and unsatisfying. The dining room, which had been full of laughter and conversation just days before, now felt tense and subdued. People were eating quickly and leaving, instead of lingering over dessert and drinks like they had been. Friday morning brought the moment everything became crystal clear. I woke up early again, but this time when I went to the deck, I saw something that made my heart race. 3 Coast Guard vessels were approaching our ship, their lights flashing even in the daylight. Within an hour, uniformed officers were boarding, and the captain made an announcement that took away any pretense of normalcy. He said federal authorities were conducting a routine inspection and that all passengers should remain calm and cooperate fully. The word routine fooled no one. You don't need 3 Coast Guard cutters for a routine inspection. Jessica grabbed my arm so tightly I thought she might leave bruises, and I could see the fear in her eyes that matched what I was feeling. The officers spread out across the ship methodically, and within minutes they were knocking on cabin doors, checking identification, and asking passengers about their activities over the past few days. When they reached our cabin, the officer was professional but thorough, asking us detailed questions about where we'd been, what we'd seen, and whether we'd noticed any unusual behavior from crew or passengers. The real shock came when we were told to gather in the main theater for a mandatory briefing. The lead investigator, a stern woman in her 50s, explained that they had received credible intelligence about illegal smuggling activities on board our ship. She said they had evidence that someone among the crew or passengers was involved in transporting illegal goods, and that the investigation would continue until they found the responsible parties. She emphasized that innocent people had nothing to fear, but that everyone would be questioned, and that certain areas of the ship would remain off-limits until further notice. The room was dead silent except for the sound of people shifting in their seats and the occasional nervous cough. Looking around at the faces of my fellow passengers, I could see the same mixture of fear and disbelief that I was feeling. This wasn't supposed to happen on a vacation. This was the kind of thing you read about in the news, not something you lived through while trying to relax and forget about your problems back home. The next few hours were a nightmare of waiting and uncertainty. They divided us into groups and questioned us one by one in conference rooms that had been turned into makeshift interrogation chambers. When my turn came, the officer asked me about everything. The voices I'd heard Wednesday morning, the strange crew members I'd noticed, even what Helen had told me about the blocked-off areas. I told them everything I could remember, feeling like I was betraying people, even though I was just trying to help. The officer took detailed notes and seemed particularly interested in my description of the crew member with the neck tattoo. After what felt like hours, they released me back to the main areas of the ship, but the atmosphere was completely different now. People were avoiding eye contact, whispering in corners, and generally acting like everyone else might be a suspect. The investigation continued for another full day, with officers going through cargo areas, crew quarters, and even passenger luggage with dogs and specialized equipment. Finally, on Saturday evening, they made an arrest. It wasn't a passenger at all. It was 3 crew members, including the guy with the neck tattoo who had been watching our table. Apparently, they had been using the ship's cargo holds to transport drugs between ports, hiding the packages in legitimate shipments and retrieving them during port stops. The blocked-off areas Helen had seen were where they'd been trying to move their operation after getting word that authorities were onto them. The voices I'd heard that Wednesday morning were them arguing about whether to dump everything overboard or try to get it off the ship at the next port. The investigation revealed that this had been going on for months, with the smugglers using their positions to access restricted areas and coordinate with contacts at various ports. Once they removed the 3 crew members, the ship's atmosphere slowly returned to normal, but the damage was done. The rest of the crews felt hollow, like we were all just going through the motions until we could get home and try to forget what had happened. Even now, months later, I still think about how a simple vacation turned into something that made me question everything I thought I knew about safety and trust. I'd saved up for over a year to book that cruise. Not one of those wild party ships, but something quieter, more relaxed. It was a mid-range line, mostly families and older couples, a few solo travelers like me. I'm a middle school history teacher from New Hampshire, and this was supposed to be my finally unplug and breathe kind of trip. The first few days were smooth. Calm sea, decent food, a friendly older couple at my dinner table who reminded me of my aunt and uncle. Then, on the 4th morning, the ship changed course. No announcement came right away, but word spread that someone had collapsed near the pool deck. A stretcher was rushed past the buffet. People whispered strokes and seizures. By noon, the captain finally came on the speakers to tell us we'd be making a brief, unscheduled stop to get the passenger medical help. We docked at a port I'd never heard of. The place looked more like a supply station than a real stop. Just one long, narrow pier connected to a handful of weather-beaten buildings. There were no signs, no colorful markets or tour guides like the other ports. Just thick, humid air and a sun that hit harder than usual. The crew made an announcement around 2 p.m., saying we could go ashore for a couple of hours while the medical transfer was happening, as long as we stayed within a designated area. Most people didn't bother, but some of us were stir-crazy and curious. I stepped off with a small group, mostly older folks, 2 teenagers, and a guy I'd chatted with earlier in the week named Brandon. He was maybe in his early 30s, wore cargo shorts and an Arizona Cardinals hat. He was quiet but friendly in a way that felt genuine. We walked around the port area, which had the weird emptiness of a place that wasn't expecting guests. A woman sold bottled water and gum out of a cooler, and one building had a tiny bar inside. No music, just a dusty fan spinning in slow circles overhead. I sat on a bench near the edge of the dock with Brandon for a bit. He talked about how he was traveling alone after a breakup. and joked that he wasn't sure if the ocean air was helping or making him feel lonelier. At around 4 p.m., a crew member started calling people back with a bullhorn, so we all trickled toward the gangway. I remember Brandon clearly. He was walking ahead of me, nodding along to something one of the teenagers was saying. He stepped onto the ship right before I did. We even exchanged a short wave before I lost sight of him in the crowd. Dinner that night was strange. The couple at my table, Martin and Evelyn, kept glancing at an empty chair near them. Martin leaned toward me and said, "Wasn't Brandon supposed to sit here?" I figured he was running late, but an hour passed and he never showed. I didn't think much of it at the time. People skip dinners all the time on cruises. Maybe he was tired or eating at the buffet. But by the next morning, the ship was buzzing. Someone said his stateroom door had been left open. Another claimed a steward had gone in and found it empty. No clothes, no bag, nothing. Then, just before lunch, a woman near the atrium started raising her voice. She said she'd seen Brandon walk back onto the ship. Not only that, 3 people jumped in to agree with her. They described the same red hat, same gray backpack, but when crew was asked about it, they denied he ever reboarded. By the afternoon, the tone on board shifted from casual concern to quiet unease. Crew members avoided direct questions, brushing off anything about Brandon with phrases like, "We're looking into it," or "We've got protocols in place." Evelyn, who'd gotten oddly protective of Brandon despite barely knowing him, started asking around. She told me she'd gone to the front desk and asked to speak to security, but the officer on duty acted like she was confused, said no one by that name was on the passenger list. That's when it got strange. I knew for a fact Brandon existed. I'd sat next to him, had conversations with him. I'd seen him step back onto the ship. But I checked the daily schedule from earlier in the cruise, and his name wasn't listed on any of the activities we'd both attended. It was like he'd been scrubbed out. I even went back to the bar we'd visited on land, just out of curiosity. I'd taken a quick photo in front of it before we reboarded. When I zoomed in, I saw a few passengers in the background, but no Brandon. I checked my phone gallery again. Nothing. Not a single image of him, even though I remembered taking a selfie while he was sitting next to me. That blank space where he should have been started to mess with my head. Evelyn swore she saw him during the lifeboat drill on day 1. A kid from the teen group said he borrowed a charger from him, but now people who'd spoken to him just 2 days ago were suddenly unsure. "Maybe I'm mixing him up with someone else," one woman said, her voice a little shaky. That night I stayed up late wandering the upper deck trying to clear my head. The ship was quiet, too quiet. Around 1:30 a.m. I passed by one of the crew-only doors near the rear stairwell and heard something. Footsteps slow and deliberate, pacing just on the other side. I stopped, waited. The steps continued for a while, then stopped abruptly. I backed away and went down a level. As I passed the small library area, I spotted something wedged behind one of the decorative plants. A laminated badge. It wasn't mine, but I picked it up. Just instinct, I guess. It had no photo. Just a first name, Brandon, and a room number. I turned to look at the hallway. His room was 2 doors down from where I stood. I hesitated, then walked there, just needing to see it for myself. The door was cracked. Not open, not shut, just sitting there like someone forgot to pull it closed all the way. I nudged it gently. The lights were off, but enough glow came from the hallway to make out shapes inside. The bed was perfectly made, nothing on the nightstand. No bags, no toiletries, not even a key card. Just a single item placed in the center of the pillow, a folded napkin, the kind they give you with drinks by the pool. I stepped in and grabbed it, half expecting some dumb joke or doodle, but there were only 2 words scribbled in uneven handwriting. "Don't follow." I stood there for way too long, napkin in hand, trying to piece together whether this was some elaborate prank or something much worse. The next morning, the napkin was gone. I know that sounds like I imagined it, but I left it folded under my journal in my cabin drawer. When I opened it, the drawer was untouched, but the napkin had vanished. I didn't tell the crew. I already knew what the reaction would be. Evelyn and I talked one last time at breakfast. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept at all. She leaned in and asked me quietly, "Did he ever tell you his last name?" I hadn't thought about it until that moment. I couldn't remember him ever saying it. No one could, not even the kid who swore he borrowed his phone charger. That's when it clicked for both of us. None of us really knew who Brandon was. After we disembarked, I called the cruise line's customer service from the airport. I didn't go in circles. I gave them the room number, the first name, described him, said he'd gone missing. The woman on the line placed me on hold for a while, then came back with a firm, rehearsed tone. "I'm sorry, sir, but no guest by that name was ever registered on that sailing." I pushed back, asked if a crew member might have used that room, or if someone snuck on. She said the room had been unoccupied the entire cruise and that internal logs confirmed that. I asked if they'd received any incident reports. She repeated the same line. I hung up, feeling like I'd stepped out of reality. I didn't sleep much the night after. I just kept thinking about that folded napkin. A few weeks later, Evelyn sent me a message through one of those cruise community forums. She'd found something strange, an archived passenger list from another ship in the same fleet from 3 years ago. It listed a Brandon C., early 30s, same home state as the guy we met. He'd gone missing during a shore excursion. His body was never recovered. According to the thread she found, he was last seen stepping back onto the ship, but no one could confirm if he made it to his room. That stopped me cold. I had to read the post 3 times to absorb it. The name, the age, the reboarding detail. It was too specific to be a coincidence. And yet no one ever talked about that incident publicly. No news, no statement from the cruise line. To this day, I still don't know if Brandon was real or if we met someone or something we were never meant to. But I know what I saw. I know we talked. I remember the Cardinals hat, the quiet voice, the way he looked out over the water like he wasn't sure he wanted to be back. I've kept a land vacation since then. I don't talk about this with people unless I know they'll believe me. Evelyn and I still check in once in a while, and every now and then she sends me a screenshot of a cruise group post that mentions a quiet guy in a red hat who vanished halfway through the trip. And every time, the first name is always the same: